Hey everyone, welcome to episode 345 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. This week I welcome back UK-based photographer Alex Nail. Alex is no stranger to the podcast, having first appeared in January of 2018. I've always been a huge fan of his mountain photography, and we've become good friends over the years, having been introduced here on this very podcast. Alex also helped me formulate my strong opinions on certain styles of photographic editing, which I've been no stranger in sharing here on the podcast, thanks to his appearance in one of the podcast's most epic episodes, episode 71. I'll put a link to those episodes in the show notes for you to reference. Alex is one of the hardest working landscape photographers that I've ever met, and his passion comes through this week in this episode. We discuss a lot of subjects along the way, but we focus a ton of our time on the trials and tribulations of his newest book, The Great Wilderness. This week's episode is brought to you by Nature Photographers Network. NPN is still my favorite hangout for nature photography. It is a community of like-minded photographers ranging in experience level from beginner all the way to full-time professional. It is a very inviting and welcoming place for photographers of all levels. My personal favorite aspect of NPN is looking at all of the great photography that is submitted there and learning from everyone's honest and thoughtful critiques of images. Even if you don't submit your own work for critique, you can gain valuable insight by reading those critiques. For just $49 per year, you can join the community on NPN and gain access to the critique forums, as well as many other incredible benefits, including fantastic articles, webinars, discounted tutorials, software, books, and a lot more. It's a great place and we'd love to see you there. Just head over to npn.link/fstop to join in. Use the code FSTOP10 for a 10% discount. That's npn.link/fstop. All right, let's get to this week's episode with Alex Nail. Alex Nail, welcome back to your fourth podcast episode.
Thank you. I'm feeling very experienced.
I'm sure by the end of this, you'll have even more experience. Yeah. Well, I had to laugh because when you reached out to me to do this podcast, you referred to yourself as a photographer working in the eyewitness tradition who infamously dragged one certain podcast host away from the perils of post-processing, which I thought was hilarious. What were you referring to there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that podcast with Erin was obviously a moment for you anyway that you've referred to a few times in your podcast. So I guess I was just poking fun at you a bit there, Matt.
No, it's fair.
I'm glad to have been part of that process.
It was a very classic episode. I think it's the most downloaded episode of the podcast. So we'll put it in the show notes. So first, for people who haven't heard of you before or who you are, tell us a little bit about who Alex Nail is.
Well, I call myself a mountain photographer actually, rather than a landscape photographer, just because that's such a, my work's so heavily biased towards mountain photography now. And I've been a professional for, I think, coming up towards 9 years now, 8 years anyway, and just try to get to remote places and put in the hard work to produce images of places that are maybe less well known to people, and try to do that as honestly as I can, I guess. I guess that's a big part of what I do. But I like to work in quite a thorough way as well. So I will revisit the same areas and try to build portfolios as opposed to sort of globe-trotting, so to speak. Yeah, and I guess I've also established a small name for myself with this whole reality and photography thing, which has landed me in trouble over the years, but I don't really regret, I suppose. Maybe on the right side of history, who knows?
Yeah, we'll get into that.
So that's me. Yeah,
and you've got a baby on the way.
Yes, thank you for announcing that on your podcast.
You're welcome.
Yeah, at the end of October. So yeah, everything's going to change then, I'm sure. But I'm hoping we can work around that. In some ways, when I'm at home, so that could actually work quite well. But yeah, I don't know. You've got to do these things and see how they work out sometimes, I think, rather than just worry about every last detail.
I think that's the way to do it right there. All right, well let's jump back. You had talked about that episode of the podcast, which literally every single person I've talked to, I'm like, oh, have you ever listened to this podcast before? And they're like, I've listened to the Alex Nail and Aaron Bobnick episode. Like everyone, I feel like has listened to that one.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, and I'm curious from your perspective, having played such a pivotal role in that particular episode. Looking back on it, do you think if in any way has that particular podcast episode had an impact on the landscape photography community from your perspective?
I mean, I don't know. You probably have a better view of that than me, actually, Matt, because I mean, in the UK, there's more people like me than there are people who would edit more freely. Let's put it that way. I think that those kind of conversations are important to have, and I think that conversation was one of many that have happened, and articles have been written and so on that have contributed to where we are now, which I think is actually in a better place. I think to a certain degree I can quieten down a little bit because I think people have heard those views now. They're pretty well fleshed out and understood, and people are making their choices from a very informed position in most cases, which I think is the most we can realistically hope for. So yeah, I like to think of that conversation as being part of, you know, a solution, an answer for some people, but only a part of it really, and actually maybe just on the start of a wave that was already building towards people pursuing photography in a more realistic manner.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. From my perspective, I think that it definitely helped open up a conversation, and it's given people a mechanism through which they can at least think about and or kind of look in the mirror a little bit to decide kind of what kind of photographer they want to be. And I think, like you said, that's probably the best we can hope for.
Yeah, I'd actually quite like to listen to that back. I haven't heard it really since you put it out, to see how my views might have changed and whether I might be less adversarial. I don't know.
Well, we're gonna actually dive into that right now. So, I know we're gonna dive into your book for sure, but I had a few other fun little topics I wanted to talk about before we got there. So, for people that have been around for the last 15 years, I would say you're probably one of the most recognized as probably one of the most opinionated photographers that I've ever met. But
What a question this is. Go on.
but I will say that it's also one of the things that I admire most about you, that you kind of stick to your guns and you don't tend to back down from your position. I'm curious, what has it been like from your point of view, being one of the more opinionated personalities dating back to sites like DeviantArt and 500px?
In some ways, I don't know how to answer that because it might not surprise you to know that that extends to every part of my life and all of my relationships, not just photography. So it's something that I have, I suppose I've chosen to be the way that I am to a large extent. So it caused arguments sometimes with my wife actually early on, until she kind of understood where I was coming from and how it was important to me to be authentic, in my opinions and in who I was. And so, I actively chose to do that, knowing that it was to the detriment of certain relationships, but to the advantage of others. So I find with my friendships, for example, that I can have deeper, richer friendships with the people who do get on with me and do know that what I say comes from the right place and that I mess up all the time and that I don't always mean what I say. But that's the same in photography, really. I think people who can take my views with a pinch of salt to a degree, but also hold their own with their own convictions, won't really have an issue with me. Whereas people who want to mischaracterize me and say that I'm just a hateful guy and all that kind of stuff goes around. I actually saw a WhatsApp group. One of my friends who I was running a workshop with at the time showed me a WhatsApp group of it was a group of mostly American photographers and some European, some very famous names in there. And they were talking about me, and it was something along the lines of, oh, that Alex Snell, he's only going on about reality and photography because he wants to get the headlines, and he's just being negative to draw attention to himself. And I just thought, what can you do? Yeah. So I've always known that it would upset some people, but I think that people having opinions is very important. I'm not sure that it's always best to do it the way that I do it, but it's the way that I've chosen. And I greatly value people who have similarly strident opinions to mine, I have to say, because I can take them with a pinch of salt. And there are a few people who, whose opinions I really admire and regularly seek out because they are pretty much unlimited in what they're willing to say.
Yeah, I've had very similar experiences myself. I've had a lot of people, call me names or whatever. Like, I had this one guy create a whole series of Instagram stories to his 100,000 followers that was basically all about how much he hated me.
Yeah.
But what can you do, right?
The thing is, I'm not sure really that that's even a reflection on the people making those comments. It's just the nature of having, distant, remote relationships through the internet. It's a pretty ineffective way of understanding who people are, even if you understand what they're saying.
I agree. Well, on the flip side of that, I'm really curious because I know we've talked a little bit about this offline, but how have you tempered your views and or approaches to discussing them publicly over the last maybe 5 or 6 years?
I think I ground myself down to a degree. I don't know. I mean, the answer is that I am very strong on subjects that I feel strongly about. And if I feel that there's less of an issue, I won't be as vocal. And I think that's one of the reasons that, to a large extent, I've been able to walk away from this post-processing debate is, I've seen so many people move in what I consider to be the right direction that I don't feel the need to strike out and say, oh, this isn't acceptable. Who do you think you are? Not that I ever did that, but maybe I should have. And I still say things. Who was I messaging the other day? Well, I probably shouldn't say the name, but there's a photographer who was, he'd shared a reel of some of the editing he was doing to his images. He was removing some distractions from the edge of his frame. And I was saying to him just out of nowhere, completely unasked for opinion, why are you doing this? Why are you removing these corrections? Because these flaws? Because one of the things that I've come to realize recently is that we as photographers teach ourselves to look for these flaws, which means that things that weren't flaws before have become flaws now, and then as you remove them you set a higher and higher standard of perfection. So yeah, I mean, I latch onto these ideas sometimes, and then when I see something that illustrates that idea, I might bring it up, but in general I am a little bit more patient and tempered with my opinions, and yes, a little quieter maybe.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, from my perspective, you're much quieter than you used to be. I mean, you still hold the opinions, but you're not shoving it down people's throats. Let's just say that.
I mean, I think what one thing that I do differently is, I suppose, apply pressure in a slightly different way. I talk to people who I think have influence, and I discuss those ideas with them, as opposed to, fairly randomly and publicly stating what I think and so on, which I think just creates pretty adversarial situations on the internet that don't really go anywhere.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, well, one more thing before we dive into the sole purpose of this whole podcast episode, which is your book. I wanted to ask you, just kind of on record, because we've actually never talked about this in length. Why did you decide to get involved in our project in the Natural Landscape Photography Awards as one of the founders, and what has that experience been like for you?
Well, so Tim and I we actually talked about it for many years, largely in response to the UK competition, and largely because the UK competition didn't seem to follow its own rules. So Tim and I actually got to know each other partly through one year there were some composites that won the competition categories. And when we pointed that out to the organisers, they sort of said, oh, well, it's within the spirit of the competition, even if it sort of directly broke their rules. And then, I think some of those prizes were stripped eventually. But anyway, I got to know Tim a little better through that, funnily enough. And we'd always talked about doing a competition in the UK just to set a really high standard. Because there wasn't really this problem in the UK, to be honest, with compositing, and that was never really a motivation, at least at that point. It was about having a competition that really represented the exceptional work that landscape photographers in the UK, in this case, were doing. And that actually, when the Wildlife Photographer of the Year stopped doing a landscape category, then that was almost the only thing that was really worth winning, that said something to me as a landscape photographer, which of course is a strange thing to say given that it was a wildlife photography competition. So that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But another big interest for me was actually burying the hatchet with the whole reality and post-processing debate, in that I could put my name behind something and say, well, look, this is what I am doing now. And you and I both know it's not a great money-making endeavor, so we must be we must be doing this for some reason. And I have enjoyed the process. I do enjoy looking at people's work and assessing it. I'm glad that I'm not one of the judges who actually decides who the winners are, to be honest, but being part of observing that process and obviously setting the framework for how the discussions between judges happen and so on, that for me has been very rewarding. So I'm still very much enjoying being part of that competition.
Yeah, I love what you said about, instead of, complaining, like, I'm going to do something about it and put my name behind it and see where that goes. And that's been a huge motivator for me as well. It's like, you can be as vocal as you want and, get into arguments with people and, chase people around with pitchforks. But until you actually do something meaningful to push the craft in a direction that you think it should go, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, exactly. And the one thing that has been really nice is the competition really has been timed just as that, there's the swell of change is happening, and the competition's kind of riding that change in a way. And we're starting to see other competitions change, and in some ways we've lost our uniqueness in terms of our processing rules and so on, because other competitions have, I don't know if they've had to catch up with us, but they've certainly had to catch up with the way photographers are thinking now about photography, and we're part of that. And that's, for me, a big success, whether it's directly the competition or not.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about your new book, The Great Wilderness. So first, let me say, knowing you and having seen your obsessive, meticulous attention to detail, I'm sure that the book is going to be incredible. I mean, I've never met anyone who actually decided that it would be a good idea to practice calligraphy for the purpose of scribing the title on their book cover and then doing a hand-drawn map insert. So tell everyone what you got going on with this book.
Yeah, well, it is a photography book. I should probably say that, because in some ways, if I'm going to talk about it, I get more excited about the book aspects, because of course the photography is done at this point. But yeah, I've spent 4 years out in this mountain area, the Great Wilderness, and one of the exciting things about that particular area for me is that it's relatively little known to the UK public. So it's actually in an area of the Northwest Highlands that there's a road that runs past it called the North Coast 500 that's become incredibly popular over the last 5-6 years. But actually from that road, you can't really see the mountains of Fisherfield and Letterhew and Dundonald, which are the mountains that make up this larger area that's colloquially known as the Great Wilderness. So part of the appeal is that, we could have this landscape in the UK that, okay, I wasn't revealing it for the first time. These are known mountains that people hike up, but at least it was fairly fresh to other photographers and to the wider public. So that's quite an exciting prospect for me in what's a very densely populated country, as we discovered during the COVID pandemic. So yeah, I pursued the photography pretty obsessively, but I've really enjoyed this last year in particular obsessing over the book itself. Yeah, I mean, making the map was a really fun process for me, actually. Learning how to use mapping software, using the UK Ordnance Survey data sets, which actually require quite a lot of massaging to turn them into a map, and then trying to embellish that and mold it into the sort of old style that I felt was evocative of the region, and and then incorporating my own calligraphy, which is something that I've actually done for many years now. My grandmother taught me calligraphy, but I just get the pens out every few years for one reason or another, and this usually to impress somebody on a birthday card or something. But it was great to spend time doing that kind of thing, thinking that other people might value that too. And that's really the ethos that's gone into the book. How can I make it the best it possibly can be? Cost be damned, basically. Yeah.
What? So what? Why a book? Why not? Why not do like a box set or an online gallery? Like, why go to all of the great lengths that are required in order to produce a high quality book?
I mean, I would love to do exhibitions and prints and do that on a regular basis and have those images seen by a lot of people. It's very, very difficult to make that happen in the UK, and particularly in the style of photography that I'm working in, these very illustrative landscapes. It's seen as a very documentary approach. I'm not sure that it's really as regarded as art in the UK. Certainly it's seen more that way in the States, but it's very rare that people are able to do solo exhibitions, at least that would run for a long period of time or be seen by a large number of people. And aside from that, obviously with a book you can present a much more extensive body of work and do something that is far more ambitious. I've actually sometimes wondered why I take the approach that I do with my photography. I'm not sure why it is, because obviously it's quite a difficult route to choose, and it's not amazingly financially productive. So it doesn't necessarily make that much sense. But I think I like the idea that I can outwork people. Other people can decide whether I'm good at what I do, whether there's any art in my approach, and so on. I'm not going to stand here and say that I'm a terrible photographer or anything like that. I find it pretty tedious when people are ridiculously modest, because it just feels false to me. But I wouldn't like to say, compare myself to other photographers on an artistic basis, but being able to create bodies of work that are out of reach of people, not because I'm a greater artist, but because I've worked really, really hard, is quite rewarding in itself to me. And I think that's a big part of producing a book, is it's very hard and therefore intrinsically worthwhile. I'm not sure how true that actually is, but that's the way I feel about it anyway.
Yeah, man, we can go so many directions off of that comment, because I know in a lot of the conversations we've had, you are a huge proponent of the grand landscape, but in particular, obviously mountains. On the surface, someone's gonna throw something at their screen or something, but on the surface, like, a photograph of a mountain is very, like you said, documentary. It's, you said illustrative. But I'm curious, when you're out making these images for the book and you're trying to, quote unquote, outwork everyone else, what are the ways in which you're trying to string things together or compose the image in a way that kind of elevates it above and beyond just another photograph of a mountain?
Well, in some ways, I'm not trying to do that. So I'm quite happy being called a documentary photographer or having people look at my work and saying, if I was stood there, I could have taken that photo. That honestly doesn't bother me. I might think that it's wrong, because of course you and I know that even if you're just framing up a view, it requires some skill, some understanding to do that well. But yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that that isn't particularly important to me, either way. But I obviously love to incorporate my own ideas when they occur to me, and I don't do that in a really forced way. If I'm on a mountaintop and there's an amazing view and there's amazing light, then the foreground really needs to justify itself in the frame. So I'm not going to start constructing complicated compositions or trying to come up with clever ideas when I think it's going to get in the way of the beauty of a scene. And beauty for me is absolutely, an amazing thing to incorporate in your images. It's not a trivial thing. It's not some lowly, aspect of the landscape that we should ignore. It's the access point to engaging people in photography and in the landscape as a whole. And I think it's a very powerful thing that I want to embrace wholeheartedly. So anything that gets in the way of that, I generally will leave out of the frame. But obviously there are times when you come across subjects which you can incorporate in a really harmonious way with beautiful qualities, or when you're working in light that's maybe less obviously beautiful, and then you're trying to elevate those scenes by doing something more interesting compositionally. But I wouldn't like to say that I set out to sort of force my art on the world, if that makes sense, or force my art upon the landscape, because I think there are some photographers who can do that very, very successfully, but they are a rare breed. And maybe one day I will get to the point where I can do that more naturally, so that it doesn't get in the way of the landscape. But at the moment, I feel like the balance for me is about right.
And let's talk about predominantly subjects in your book. Are we talking, for the most part, grand scenics? I mean, are you incorporating any smaller vignettes of nature in your book, like textures of rock, or is it straight, just beautiful landscape, classic landscape scenes?
Straight up classic landscapes. Yeah, no, I've not given in to the modern passion for intimate scenes. The answer to that is there are a few photographers who've done that with their Scottish landscapes. Joe Cornish is one, Colin Pryor is another, both iconic and incredibly talented photographers, groundbreaking photographers. And I have never personally been engaged by that work that they have produced. I've been engaged by the grand landscapes, and of course there are some cases where those smaller landscapes provide real context, and I've thought, okay, that works, but that's the exception rather than the rule. And I know, having spoken to Joe about it, that he feels that those smaller scenes are very important in his work, but that isn't the way I feel about them. And similarly with my own work, except for I'm not as good at shooting those scenes as Joe is. And it's really difficult being an artist or being in an artistic field and having expectations for yourself and setting goals and making comparisons. And I think that's something that is a problem for me. In some ways that can push you forward to excellence. In others, it stops you creating things entirely. And when I look at the work of somebody like David Ward, who I still think is underappreciated, please do go and look at his work. I see all of the brilliance of a photographer who's dedicated himself to shooting intimate scenes. And I think if I want to include intimate scenes in my book, they need to be that good. But I haven't got a lifetime of experience behind me. So I tried. I tried many times. I think the Scottish intimate landscapes, let's say, are a lot more complex than you might find in other areas of the world. We have highly textured rock, grasses that fly all over the place, muddy pools, and it can be very difficult to find the levels of simplicity that lend themselves easily to intimate scenes. Let's put it that way. So yeah, I tried, and I have a couple of shots that are okay, but they didn't go into the book, because then that feels very incoherent. If you just have a few of these scenes, you need to take a fairly consistent approach. So yeah, it's just grand landscapes.
Well, it's like you said, sticking to your guns. Speaking of strong opinions, I know you have very, very high standards for photography books. What, in your mind, makes or breaks a photography book, and what can others do to make their book stand out?
My favorite photography books are photography books that have a strong idea behind them. So it doesn't need to be a book of a place, like this book obviously is, but something where the photographer has set out to achieve something. I mean, they may not have started the project with the intent of making a book, but let's say at least halfway through, they've decided, okay, here's the book, here's the concept, now here's how I'm going to flesh it out. And then they start physically putting the book together and thinking which images are going to work together and how they can create a flow through the book, or a story, or a feeling. And I don't have a massive collection of books, and the books that I buy and that I keep are the ones that follow roughly that pattern. My two absolutely reliable photographers for doing that at the moment are Theo Bosboom and Sandra Bartocca. And actually, Sandra has done some of the work on Theo's books as well, which I think does show through. And then there are photographers who I just find inspirational, who I love their greatest hits books, because they're inspirational photographers for me. So I do understand the appeal of that style of book. But in general, when people put out a greatest hits book, which to me is, okay, I've taken enough photos of this place, now let's just chuck a book together, or these are the best photos I've taken in the last 3 years, so let's see if I can attach a few little stories to each one, and sell a book that way. I mean, I completely understand why that would appeal to somebody who's a fan of their work, but to me, I'm looking for a book that elevates the work as a whole to something entirely different, that isn't just a collection of standalone images.
Let's talk about design a little bit. What are some of the considerations that you've had to make in terms of paper, the texture of the paper, the thickness of the paper, the is it glossy, is it matte, and then you have layout of images. Like, what are some of the things you've had to kind of wrap your head around, and maybe talk through some of the choices that you made?
So I may be a bit unusual when it comes to paper, in that I want my prints to be on beautiful paper and maybe varied paper, but I actually don't want to see the paper in a photography book. I can find that gets in the way of the images, particularly sort of heavier weight images, papers, which then you would even struggle to open a double page spread. So I prefer simple silk papers. Matte papers work brilliantly with certain styles of photography. Sandra actually has, I think, a couple of her books are on a matte paper, and it works brilliantly well with this sort of more painterly feel that she's achieving with her images. But with grand landscapes, it would be completely wrong. So I think you're almost forced down a sort of silk, even if it's a textured silk line. Glossy just looks garish. So I think you have to go with that kind of finish. Whether you have a slight texture, I suppose, is personal choice. But for me, the texture then gets in the way of the images, and it does make the book more expensive. So I mean, if I'm not getting any benefit out of it myself, it's not something I'm even going to consider. Yeah, with the other production aspects, I mean, I think it's really important that books are viewed as physical things, not just sort of delivery devices for images, because that for me is a lot of the fun of books. It's seeing how people have put their own personality into the cover design and their materials choices, and how the images are sequenced, obviously, but all of those peripheral aspects I think are quite important. They build towards a bigger whole, and it's a bit like making a plate of food look beautiful. It tastes better. There's lots of studies that show that. A book is the same thing. It's very important to package your book in a way that is pleasing. And I love the traditions around bookbinding. I mean, I kind of have a sort of interest in it now. I follow various bookbinders who are, rebinding in really traditional ways, leather binding and so on. So I have that kind of interest anyway. But for me, using cloth covers is quite important, because not only is it a more durable way of binding, but I think it's understated and beautiful, and it sort of leans into that feel of what I might be wanting to achieve with my images. Even if I've got fiery sunsets, I'd like to think that my approach to them at least is understated. I'm not amping them up beyond what they were. I mean, I think about all those things and then fall asleep thinking of cover designs. I can't tell you how many times I've redesigned this book cover in my head as I fell asleep. I'm weird like that, but it works for me. I often drift off that way.
So I've got your first book here, which has a very, I would say, there's not a lot going on the cover. It's just
very
the title.
minimal. Yeah.
Very minimal. But you've got the kind of the linen kind of cloth cover that you had referred to, and maybe talk about the design. Like, are you sticking to a very similar design with an image and a very simple description, or is there going to be more to it than that?
Yeah, I am. I am sticking to exactly the same theme, really, as was in that book. Chapters with introductions and stories in there. For me, that was something I was really happy with the first book, because I think obviously you want to break the work down in some way, otherwise it becomes really monotonous. And I think that's actually a very important part of book design. There's actually one of my favorite books that I have opened continually throughout this book design process is Colin Pryor, this Scottish photographer's book. He produced a book called Fragile, which is pairing birds' eggs with the landscapes that those birds live in, and he'll try to colour match quite often the egg to the landscape where that's possible. And it's just a very beautiful idea that's been perfectly executed. But one thing that he has done is recognise just how monotonous it could be if you went egg, landscape, egg, landscape, egg. I mean, it's the same idea repeated 50 times. And of course, that is the nature of the book. There's no getting away from that. But he's done a brilliant job of doing full page spreads of one egg, for example, or he'll have multiple eggs on a page and then the landscape's on fire because it's a fire affected landscape. And he's very, very purposely thought about how that sequence works to break up the book. I've done that in a much more simple way, chapters, chapter headings, chapter descriptions, but then the stories for me add a bit of context. They explain what goes into the work, and that was something I was happy with the last book, and I've kept that the same. Similarly with the page design, actually, I mean, I thought you were going to ask about that when you opened the book, actually, because the way photos sit on the page really matters to me. And I'm quite particular. I don't know if I've kind of just seen my own book too often or something. But when I see, so some of Sandra's, I mean, keep going back to Sandra, some of Sandra's layouts I just don't like at all. And I completely understand from a design perspective why they're dynamic and how that puts a design aesthetic on top of the images that, again, builds towards this greater whole. So she's doing something very different there, which is showing her skills as a designer and expressing herself as a designer, with the photos as the vessel, as well as the delivery of her own, photographic ideas. So it's kind of design on top of art. But I don't really want to do that with my book. I don't want to show my skills as a designer, if I have any at all, and I'm not sure that I do, by the way, over the top of the images. I want to display just the images, and so that is very much what I've done. And in most cases I will either do a full bleed image, so that's an image that runs to the edges of the page, or it has a healthy white border, and nothing really in between, and no tiny images in the top corner of the page, no blank pages. It's another thing that book designers will often incorporate, blank pages, to give you some breathing space. I've never really experienced that myself, so again, it's not something I'm going to do, but I understand the idea at least.
So you've got one book done, which I think I don't know, maybe, do you feel like your first book was successful?
Yes, I do. I wouldn't like to admit to the things that were unsuccessful about it. There are some things. There are some things that I would change, but because I put in a huge amount of effort into it and a lot of consideration, I don't have any regrets, which is a nice place to be. Some of the problems with the book were out of my control. Some of them were within my control. Typos, American spellings. God. Yeah, but yeah, I'm still very happy with it, and it's not it's not ever going to change. I don't think, but I have nevertheless developed my ideas in that time, and particularly improved my understanding of what goes into making a good book and what it takes to print an image really well, so that the next one will be better.
So you're making yet another book, and as you and I both know, having worked on 2 book projects with NLPA, and you've got your own book, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. You've got, you've got problems at the printer that can happen. You've got typos, as you've described. You've got shipping. You've got storage. You've got so many different things that are just, in your control, but not in your control. And then there's all these things that just can go so wrong. So are you some kind of crazy masochist, or do you just really enjoy complicating your life?
I mean, I think it's Emily, my wife, that I feel most sorry for, to be honest. I mean, I think the last book was just far enough away that she's forgotten how annoyed she got having boxes of books lying around the house. Yeah, I mean, I think the hardest thing at the start is that you're not actually making any money. You've just got lots of books. Actually, this book release was timed around child number 1 to fill in a little bit of a financial gap, which maybe will start to happen next year. But there's a lot that goes into it. But then I suppose I've never actually thought of the downsides of all those things, because to me, being able to deliver a body of work that could be seen by 1,000+ people is, just a far greater thing than any of the downsides. And I also quite like solving some of those problems. So particularly the technical problems, the problems around printing, I've started to get really interested in that, really get into the weeds of how to get that just right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I've got, I don't know, what is that, 5 boxes of books right there in the corner. That's just the ones that aren't in storage. So yeah. There's a lot that goes into it, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of that here a little bit later, for sure. But, and I think those are some of the kind of practical questions people have about books, especially self-publishing versus using a publisher, things like that. But I want to make sure I don't forget to cover one more question around kind of the theme of your book and thematic books in particular. So, I mean, earlier you had spoken to the fact that you really like thematic books over greatest hits, so for lack of a better term. And I certainly don't disagree with you. I actually really like thematic books as well. However, I feel like most photographers would be very hard-pressed to create a book in that style without a great deal of planning, dedication, and purpose to focus what it is they're actually making their book about. And I know you did the same, so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what that realistically looked like for you, including the amount of time you spent creating images for the book, not only just in terms of how many years it took, how many years did you focus your effort on it, but also how many days or hours in the field did you spend?
Yeah, I haven't actually calculated the days in the field. That'd be an interesting one, but I did add up all my hikes. This is going to seem like nothing to you because you've just done this ridiculous hike in Colorado, of course. But I hiked 420 miles in the Great Wilderness, and more than half of that was with groups. And so most of the time, with breaks and stops and so on, I was going about 2 to 3 kilometers an hour, depending on the terrain and whether you're off path and how much you're carrying and how slow the group is and so on. And I'm trying to remember now my fig. I mean, it was something like a month walking 6 hours a day. It was some ridiculous amount of time just physically walking, which actually, when I think about how the trips work, makes sense because I camped for I think it was 48 or 49 nights actually in the mountains there, and then every day I'm walking for, minimum 4 hours, but 6 hours quite often, and not as hard or as fast as I can walk. That's not the purpose of the trip. But you can see how that adds up pretty quickly in terms of hiking time and hiking effort and time out in the elements. I wouldn't know how to account for the days when you don't go because the weather is rubbish, and to wait and get that weather window. There's a lot of people who, of course, assume that if I've got an amazing sunset from a mountain, then it must be because I've been up 10 times. But of course, if you're going up a lot of mountains, sometimes you get lucky the very first time and never go up again. And certainly that's the case with some of the images in the book. One of the mountains, Evasion, which is the most remote mountain, or Munro, a peak over 3,000 feet in Scotland, because the views there are so exceptional. There's 3 absolutely outstanding and completely separate views from one mountain, which is very unusual. At least have views of that caliber. Usually a mountain would have one of this really high caliber and then little subsidiary details and so on, but it really is an unbelievable summit. It's got a wide grassy plateau suitable for camping, water source 200 meters below. So every trip I've done with groups, I've taken people up Evasion, almost every trip. So I went up there 10 times for this book, and that alone is is a lot of visits to one mountain. But it's been interesting photographing that mountain because, of course, I saw it in a whole variety of different conditions and seasons too. I went up there in the winter, which was a very long-held dream of mine, actually. So I was pretty emotional when I got up there in these perfect conditions. Winter is fickle in the UK, so even to have suitable snow conditions is lucky enough. But to be able to get up the most remote Munro, I doubt any photographer has done that, actually. They might have, but I certainly haven't heard of it. That was a big moment. But one of the funny things about having gone up Evasion 10 times was on about the 5th visit, I found this rock. It's sort of the shape of a coffin, and about the size of a coffin, and in this really interesting conglomerate. And geology is sort of part of the interest of photographing these areas. And I thought, right, I've got to get back to that stone. It made this lovely geometric composition with the mountains interlocking behind it. And I visited 5 more times and never had the opportunity to take the photo of this. And I loved this composition so much that I was like, right, line in the sand. I'm not publishing the book until I've got this photo. Anyway, I never got that photo. So there's always something more to do. And I'll look forward to going back to that mountain. But yeah, there's a lot that I didn't do, to be honest. There's paths that I didn't walk that I wanted to. You do have to stop at a certain point. As much as I would like to say no stone left unturned, that would be a lifetime's work to literally do that. So, yeah.
So what did it look like for you to decide enough's enough, I have enough to make a book, or I'm good to go?
So the winter trip was the absolute key for me. So, waiting for winter in Scotland can be really infuriating, but nowhere more so than the Northwest Highlands, because its proximity to the sea means that it's a lot milder than other areas. So the Gulf Stream, flows past the UK and gives us one of the greatest warming effects for our latitude anywhere in the world. In fact, it's only the Lofoten Islands in Norway that's greater. So we could have the same climate as Halifax, but it's fortunately a lot warmer here. But that warming effect of the sea, it does bring in all these storms and all this moisture, which creates lovely dynamic weather. We've certainly got no shortage of dramatic clouds and so on, but that warming issue is a big problem for winters that have become milder and wetter over time as well. So I set aside enormous amounts of particularly January, February and March every year for 3 years, knowing that I would need to do that. And you can imagine how expensive that is and how frustrating. I mean, you're telling friends, yeah, sure, I can come to your birthday, but not if I need to go to Scotland. And, there's all of the sort of family type stuff and friends stuff that you would ordinarily plan that kind of potentially has to be shelved. You can't go away on holiday. You can't plan workshops. Everything is put on hold. And of course, there were some exceptions to that. But when this winter spell finally came, I have to say it was an incredibly inconvenient time. I was not in Emily's good books for various reasons. I let her down quite significantly then. But I had to go because this was the one spell in 3 years where I suspected I would be able to get these images of fresh snow. And once I'd done that, I had represented all of the seasons in all of the chapters of the book. And so then I felt like I had the diversity of images where I could say, okay, we publish next year. Now we just push, see if I can, fill in the gaps, dot the I's and cross the T's, and then we publish.
That's amazing. So when you set out with this whole book idea, it sounds like you had a pretty good idea of you wanted to represent all 4 seasons of this area. Were there any other considerations that you had in terms of like, oh, I have to have, these 10 mountains, or like, how did you determine your shot list?
That's actually a good question because, yeah, I absolutely did do that. One of the funny conversations actually that crops up from time to time in landscape photography is, do you plan your images?
Right.
And it's very in vogue to say, oh no, I just respond. I'm an artist. I just float around, and when I see something, I use my skills and transform it into something magical. I've never really approached photography that way, but it would never work doing the kind of photography that I do. I mean, of course, you would get lucky sometimes, but in order, if you want to represent these kind of grand scenes in transcendent lighting conditions, it doesn't just happen. You have to really try for that. You have to look at weather forecasts, time your ascents, consider everything that's going into a trip, potentially with the idea of getting to one place on one evening that's forecasted 3 days out. And so I never actually wrote it down in a list, but because in my previous book, Northwest, I'd done a chapter on the Great Wilderness, I had a good idea of the potential of the area and the various scenes that I could be incorporating. I had a number of scenes where I just said, right, I throw everything at these things, making these the best they possibly can be. And that doesn't necessarily mean, it has to be heavy clouds overhead with a gap on the horizon for a red sun to shine through, though, of course, if that happens, great. But it meant that the weather and lighting conditions really had to be bringing something to the view so that I think it's just a really good way to get people to engage with landscape photography through these powerful images. It still works. And it still excites me. It's something that motivates me. So that can give me the impetus to go into these areas again and again and again. And then you respond, and then you find all of these other scenes, and then you fill in all the gaps in a sort of photographic narrative, so to speak. So I was very deliberate. I did have, I guess, maybe a dozen scenes where, I just went at them incessantly until I felt I was successful. And the rest kind of fell into place around those images.
And then I'm curious too, like, have you been sharing a lot of the images that you've created for the book, or have you been kind of keeping them close to the vest, knowing that they'd be revealed to the world in the book?
I mean, that's another thing that I love to do if I can, is keep as much of the work back as possible. Obviously, that isn't entirely possible, and it's not entirely savvy either, because you want to be able to market the book. So some of those images I have sort of let escape into the ether one way or another. Whether it's been in a couple have been in a calendar or a print box, but I think if you are really obsessive about my work, some sort of like stalker type who's bought everything I've ever sold and watched every video I ever put out, then you might have seen 40% of the images, something like that.
Okay.
Maybe even 50. But most people will have seen maybe a quarter of them if they've watched a lot of my YouTube videos and so on. So yeah, most of them are kept back, and I think that's because when I've opened books and seen a whole load of new work, I found that incredibly exciting. And that always used to be the case. When I bought these books from Joe Cornish and David Ward and Colin Pryor, there's hardly an image that I'd ever seen before. But of course, social media has changed all that. And I think it is a shame when you buy a book from a photographer and it's sort of all work that you've seen before, as much as you can still think that it's amazing work, of course. So yeah, that's been a difficult thing to do, but then it's also quite nice to not have to worry about posting your work. And don't go on any of my social channels. I mean, I basically started posting again just to announce the book. It's pretty awful.
Like, oh, he hasn't posted since 2018. Okay, then.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
No.
I must have something to sell. Yeah.
Right. Well, let's talk about printing. What actually, what all is involved in the printing process? What all have you had to go through in order to get this thing from concept to actual physical print? Which it's not even there yet, right?
Yeah, so I go to print on Monday,
Which
or a week, yeah, on Monday. Yeah,
which right now we're
6 days or whatever.
end of September, and this episode will come out later. But
That's right. Yeah. So I'm printing on, well, is it Monday the 2nd of October? And then baby comes at the end of October. So I'm actually delaying the delivery of the books, but usually it's, a few weeks to bind and then you get delivery. So it's maybe a month delay. Everything's being done in the UK, incidentally, because I think that's really important to me to be able to be on press, but also to support an industry that has a pretty proud history in the UK and all the jobs and all that good sort of thing, which I think is worth paying for. And boy, do you pay for it.
yeah,
But yeah, the actual print process is interesting. You do need to understand color and what you're going to lose in the process potentially. So litho printing is based on 4 colors: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which most people will know, CMYK. Which incidentally, I'm probably going to call CYMK because for some reason that glitch happens to me. I say the letters in the wrong order. But because you have only these 4 colors, that does somewhat restrict the color gamut that you have available. In practical terms, for most landscape photographers, particularly if you have fairly sensible colors in your images, excepting sunsets and so on, when of course you get full saturation, you're only really going to get problems with blues if you have a perfect process. So a strong ultramarine blue can only be reproduced in litho printing by combining cyan and magenta. But cyan and magenta together are not as intensely blue as a blue pigment might be. So you lose saturation there. And in some ways, it's like going from Adobe RGB into sRGB, and I don't want to get into that whole thing because I've got some opinions there too. I work in sRGB, which does make it a little easier to go into CYMK. The vast majority of my images would be within the CYMK gamut anyway, but some of the colors are slightly out of gamut, and so you would lose some saturation. So then you have to make the choice between keeping them hue accurate and losing the saturation, or shifting the hue slightly and increasing the saturation. So, for example, one of my favorite snow scenes, in fact, the snow scene from Evasion that I am, is one of my great achievements, if you like, not artistically, but from an effort perspective, this long-held dream.
right. Everything came together.
Exactly. So the light was failing, and it had just the right softness to pick up the shape of the snow, but fundamentally you're drifting into blue light, and so the valley that I was shooting down into, covered in snow, is just reflecting the blue of the sky, and it's an ultramarine blue. In that case, I had to keep some of the color intensity there, so I do a combination of desaturating the blue and allowing it to shift slightly into cyan, because that's the closest way to evoke what I intended, if you like. Although it does create the complexity that for the people who ordered that print for my print, the collector's edition, the print isn't going to match that particular image perfectly, but at least they're getting the better version as a loose print. But there aren't too many images where you need to make that kind of correction. Mostly, if you have a well-calibrated screen and an understanding of how to move between color spaces, you should be able to see the change happening on screen firstly, so you can adapt if necessary, but also the change should be very small to the point that it isn't even a problem. And then you can get into issues with blacks, and that's quite a complex subject too. With lithoprinting, you can't achieve quite the same contrast that you could with a giclée print on a desktop print or with a lab, and certainly not compared to, say, one of the acrylics that you have behind you there. So if you've lost that contrast, the question is, do you want to lose the contrast across all your images to a small extent, or do you want to swallow the blacks a bit more and keep the contrast in your midtones and highlights? So there's a trade-off to be made there. In some cases, I've allowed the blacks to be swallowed a little bit, but in most cases, I've allowed them to be swallowed and then lifted them, if that makes sense.
For
So
sure.
I kind of get the best of both worlds, just massaging the detail in the deep shadows. And that is a complexity of lithoprinting that maybe does need a little bit of experience, because in order to get the blackest black, you don't just put down 100% black, you put down CYMK, so mostly black, but you want to put down color as well, because that's going to create an even deeper black that's known as rich black. And different print standards have different definitions for what rich black actually is in terms of the amount of CY and M, or CM and Y. So you can definitely get into the real nitty gritty of it with that sort of stuff. But in Europe, we're usually working to the Fogra 39 standard for coated papers, and that kind of defines what these things are. And really, for most photographs, it's just a matter of converting to that profile and then making minor adjustments, and of course doing all your resizing and sharpening and all that business as you usually would with a normal print.
So I'm imagining you've got your Lightroom catalog. I'm guessing you're probably using collections to, like, this is all the stuff that's going into the book, and then you have a version of the file that's probably for print, and then you've like duplicated it to convert to CYMK, and then you make the adjustments to that, and then you're exporting that for the book and exporting the other for the prints.
That is exactly what I'm doing here. So,
all right.
Just so I rename the files that I'm using for the book just to identify them very clearly and to sort of keep a master PSD that I don't do any conversions to. I create a Photoshop action to automate the conversion to the color space, that I don't make any mistakes when I'm doing that. And I have an action to automate the resizing as well, so that I'm hitting 300 pixels per inch for every image and that sort of thing. And then I save that as a PSD in a separate folder, and that becomes my master for when I'm tweaking the files for print. And every image actually finishes as a JPEG, because you absolutely cannot see the difference between JPEGs and TIFFs, and it makes the file sizes much smaller.
I know this is a question that comes up all the time when people are thinking about doing a book. How much has this cost you, and what kind of decisions did you make in order to evaluate cost, quality, and shipping?
Oh, you're not going to like the financial side, Matt, because I know you're a numbers guy who likes to look at this kind of optimization. To be honest, I put so much effort into this book. I've always falsely believed that people will pay for quality. The cream or rice, that all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's basically nonsense. I think anybody who knows about marketing and business knows that marketing and price points and cutting costs and all that are the way to making a financial success out of something. But the truth is that if you make a book like this, it's such a big personal statement that it just isn't acceptable to me to cut corners in any aspect of it, to be perfectly honest. I mean, within reason. I mean, it's not, gold leaf or anything, but anything that I think can contribute to the quality and overall impression of the book, I've just done that because, if it costs, I mean, for example, debossing the design into the cover as well as foiling, that adds, I think, 60p a book or something. So times that by 1,500, which is probably the number of books that I'm going to print. And you're getting up towards £1,000 to deboss as opposed to foiling. Which is why you'll see some books that either deboss or foil, but not both. The book cloth that I chose, that added, I can't remember if it was £500 or £1,000 in the end, but I tested the book cloth and it's beautiful, it's rich, but it also doesn't mark easily, which has been something that's bugged me about other people's books in the past. So I haven't really done anything to cut costs at all. Oh no, there was one thing actually. It actually worked out slightly more expensive to use coloured end papers than my own design. So I thought, well, I'll obviously design my own end papers because that's just a much nicer thing anyway. So they will also be printed end papers. That's the paper that connects the case of the book, the cover of the book, to the book block itself, the pages. But I mean, one of the really difficult things about book printing is numbers. It's a numbers game, and really you want to be as famous as possible to print a book. And maybe people know me who listen to this podcast because I had this. I've been on 3 times or whatever, and you know me. But most people don't. Most photographers don't. I'm not a huge YouTuber or anything like that. I'm not some big fish in the landscape photography world, even if I've got a loud mouth. And so I can't print vast numbers of books. But I can print enough to make it financially viable, particularly if I can get pre-orders to help pay for the book run. But roughly speaking, in the UK, to make a book print viable, litho printing, you have to print 500 books. It's the bare minimum that you could make ends meet, unless you manage to achieve some astronomically high price for each individual book. So roughly speaking, let's say one book is going to cost £15,000 and 1,500 books is going to cost £28,000. It's kind of like that. The setup cost is absolutely astronomical because the way you actually produce each page is you create a number of aluminium prints, sort of sheets of aluminium that have the C or Y or M or K imprinted into the surface of the aluminium. Those print plates are then used to actually, on the press to run the inks through. And that whole process is slow, getting the initial plates created and then put into the machine. Of course, that takes time on the machine. But once you press go, the paper just comes out. I mean, if you've watched Catch Me If You Can, where Leonardo DiCaprio is going nuts as all these, things are being printed out, it's that kind of crazy speed. They just absolutely fly off the press, faster than 1 a second, or as fast as 1 a second, let's say. So the time on press to print 1,000 versus 2,000, I mean, it makes hardly any difference compared to the setup time of the press. So there's a point where you're just paying for materials effectively. So the run-on cost for these books that I'm producing is £10.79. So I'm selling the book for £49, which obviously then I go, woo, I can make £39 a book, but that's only the run, that's the run on cost. Okay, so that's not considering the initial setup cost. But obviously, if you printed a million books, then they have basically cost you £10.79 a book. But of course, what that means is you are always enticed to print more. And because the setup cost is so astronomical, you can't do a second run, or at least you would need similar demand to do a second run. So if I print 1,500 books, it costs X. But if I print another 1,000 books, it's going to cost me £10,000. So, you know, 1/3 of what I've already spent. But if I can't sell 1,000 books, if I'm just storing those books, then it becomes a bit of a fool's game. So it is, in some ways I quite like it, because it's like fortune favors the brave stuff. And my last book, if I ordered another 500 books, maybe even 1,000 books, I could have sold them by now. But that doesn't mean I'm able to just recklessly gamble. So yeah, it's an interesting one. It's really fascinating. And that's of course why some people do avoid it entirely, because you don't want to be lumbered with masses of books. And it's why the pre-orders are so important, because you can break even earlier on in the process and also get rid of a load of stock very, very quickly.
And what was your thinking on shipping? Because I know when we did the NLPA books, one of the hardest things for us is how much of the shipping costs we want to eat, especially for people who don't live in the UK or in the United States or whatever. And as you've done the math on it, I mean, to ship a book to Australia or New Zealand, it's usually like, I don't know, like $70. I mean, it's nuts, you know?
Yeah, so I think NLPA is different because it's an international competition, and so you have, you know, such a great proportion is going internationally that it becomes a major consideration, to the point that it isn't viable unless you're charging sensibly for postage. For me, 2/3 of the books will end up in the UK, where the postage cost is low, and so then I have to consider how much I want people to have books in other countries, basically, and how much of the margin that I do have, because of course there is margin there, assuming that I can sell all my books. There will eventually be margin. That's probably a better way of putting it. How much of that am I willing to give up to make sure that people who've supported my work and who want to support my work can get a copy of a book that I'm very proud of? And the answer to that is quite a lot of that margin. So Australia, New Zealand, and the US in particular, I'm paying half the postage cost roughly. So I figured out the other day that I think I make 17 or 18 pounds once I've sold every single one of my books. So I mean, at this point, it's just a massive loss leader until I've sold, let's say, I don't know, 1,100 books or something, is when I'm gonna, you know, start to get past the margin that I would be making money on those books that have already sold, if that makes sense. I mean, of course, it all depends on how you think about this. But yeah, I mean, basically, I'm just going in debt on the postage because I think in the long term, that's the right thing to do. That, you know, obviously I can sell more books that way, and I should, in the long run, still make a profit on those sales. But it is a difficult thing to do. I sat down with my spreadsheet the other day and realized that I already owe £3,000 on postage, which is a lot of money. Yeah.
Right, because you have a bunch of orders, pre-orders.
Yeah, and like, it's really great to get orders from the US, but I can't. One of the reasons I can't extend that postage offer past the pre-order stage, and unfortunately by the time, well, I probably will offer some discount because I still want people to be able to buy it. But postage to the US is £34. Well, by the time pre-orders are over, I have a finite number of books, and I have to believe that I'm going to sell them. So obviously, if I'm selling them and making a much smaller margin by selling them to the US, that becomes a much more difficult prospect, which is why I'm incentivizing it so heavily now. But yeah, it's difficult, and it's not actually something that you really want to be thinking about as a photographer or somebody who spent a lot of time on a book, is how best to strategize your postage pricing. But there you go.
Well, not only postage, but how you ship it. I mean, like with the materials you use to physically get it from point A to point B. I know that I mean, I had spreadsheets where I'm like, okay, it costs this much to ship it in this kind of box with, this type of bubble wrap or whatever, and it costs this much to do it this way, and
Hmm.
it's it's like you said, that's not what we got, why we became
Yeah.
photographers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the NLPA book is big and it's heavy, and that is a problem when it comes to packaging in particular. I mean, this book will be with its packaging under 2 kilos, which helps for postage, but it also helps for damage during postage.
Uh-huh.
And I do have the
Yes.
experience of the last book. The only books that actually got damaged were in the US internationally, believe it or not. I think one got lost somewhere else. I had one of my limited edition books. It actually had a hole going all the way through the packaging and the book itself, like a pole had impaled it somehow. So yeah, I had like half a dozen books that went to the US, never got there or were badly damaged, but everywhere else was absolutely fine. I think one book was lost in the UK, and so I tend to use reinforced cardboard packaging and no bubble wrap, and that's worked very well for me. And then I just replace anything that doesn't arrive or gets damaged, obviously.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about publishing, self-publishing versus using a publisher. Obviously, you're self-publishing, but what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to self-printing versus going with an established publisher, say like Kozu, or here in the States like Rocky Nook or something like that?
I mean, so there's a massive scale here, and very simply, it's how much control do you want to give up over every aspect, from how much money you're going to make to how the book is designed, because you can find an option at every end of the spectrum. I mean, you've just mentioned two publishers that are relatively small scale, I think, and really allow the photographers an enormous amount of control over image sequencing and page design and so on. So in some ways that's a printer, at least in the case of Kozu, is actually based in Bath. So that's where I live. I could have just gone down the road there, but I actually use a different printers. Kozu are a printers themselves, and they've effectively set up a business that helps photographers publish books. And I'm not sure what the financial arrangement is there exactly, but of course they're taking on some of the financial risk, and so they're taking some of the profit as well, as they should do, of course, and that makes the job a lot easier for the photographer, particularly when that publisher's dealing with some of the distribution as well. So that's just one model, and then at the most commercial end of the spectrum, you do still have publishers who essentially say, okay, this is the book we want to produce, so you provide us with those images, and we're going to put them together with our own words, with our own writer, and you concede all control of quality and image selection and
Right.
so on to the publisher. So
I was gonna say, like, it seems very unlikely that you would find any publisher who would go for some of the things that you're wanting to do in terms of like the linen covers and the embossing and including like a nice map and things like that. They're all about cutting costs and making it economically viable, which that makes sense. But at the end of the day, like that's not the direction you wanted to go as an artist.
yeah, I mean, I actually would, because I've actually had two publishers who did ask me if we could do something together, but you're still in this situation where you give up a degree of control. So I still would have had a lot of influence over well, almost total influence over the design of the book and material selection and so on, but maybe not complete. Maybe I would have had to go for a slightly simpler book cloth or something like that. But the, the the other side of things is, everything is mass produced. They're dealing with the distribution, taking a huge chunk of that profit to the point that you're getting £4 a book or something. That can be brilliant if they're going to sell 10,000, but less good if they're going to sell 2,000.
Right.
So yeah, it's you would have to weigh up all those decisions on a case by case basis, because there are different options that are suitable for different photographers. And certainly if you're an amateur photographer or even a professional who can't sell 1,000 books just like that, there are ways to digitally print where you can find a market for smaller runs of books and create exclusivity in different ways to do it yourself. Or you might collaborate with other photographers working with a publisher to put something out. There are various compilation books that are released in every country every year with multiple photographers. That's one route of access into book publishing. But to be honest, one of the great things about the market is that there is so much diversity and that there is a growing market for photography books. I do think that they're a brilliant way to buy people's work, and it's something that I will continue to do. Because I just think they're fantastic things, and particularly when they are well designed and when the materials are nice and so on.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I have this book that I co-authored, and I had a publisher, and they printed 20,000 copies. It's not like a photography book per se, right? But it's got a lot of photography in it. I think I should know this, but I think I get like $3 or $4 if I sell one or something. They sell it. It retails for $26.95, and so like I have to. I effectively have to sell all 20,000.
Yeah, I mean the biggest margin that I've heard of from a company that does all of the distribution and your commercial book, if you like, is 18%. That's the highest percentage, and that's of the retail price. It's the price that the publisher themselves achieves for the book. So when they're going to Amazon, for example, the distributor buys it at X and Amazon sells it at Y, and so actually, they get £10 for the book, whereas if they sell it direct, they might get 30. So your 18% changes quite a lot that way. But that's the way the book market works.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, if you can take on the financial risk and you think you have a viable way to market it, you have an audience, self-publishing, while wrought with a lot of potential pitfalls, as I've talked to many photographers about, I do think it is probably economically one of the better ways to do it.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to have the stomach for it, for sure. It wouldn't be the right choice for everybody, but economically it can work out well. I mean, if I sold every book at full price, which I won't, then it would be just about justifiable as a piece of work, as in I could pay myself for my time. And of course, all that work is done, and I partly supplemented it by running workshops at the same time. Cue the angry keyboard warriors, Alex Nail taking his own photos on a photography workshop. But no, I mean, my clients have been very gracious with that sort of thing, and that's how I've made these projects possible, really. And I've made that very clear to my clients on my trips. So if you sell everything, it works pretty well. I've done calendars the last 2 years, not sold out, made £500 last year on my calendar, having shipped 300 of the 500 that I printed. So, you have to be very careful not to get burned with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, well, I mean, we could probably talk about this all day, but we're running out of time. Who do you recommend for the podcast? Who are some photographers that we've yet to have on the show that you think we need to learn more about?
Yeah, I mean, the top guy I think to have on now is Mark Littlejohn. I've done a few trips with him, actually. He lives up in in the Northwest Highlands, very close to the Great Wilderness, actually, on the edge of it. He's an ex-police officer who now lives a somewhat quiet life up on the northwest coast of Scotland, but he's a very interesting guy. He's got a great personality. He doesn't take himself too seriously. Always a really good laugh, but lots of really interesting opinions. And he's actually an interesting guy to follow on social media because he posts these diatribes about his everyday life, which are very entertaining actually, and posts his own photography along with those. Kenny Muir is another Scottish photographer who's done brilliantly actually in the competition recently. But he's done a lot of photography in Glen Affric, beautiful Caledonian pine area. I just think his work is fantastic. Very dedicated photographer. And Brian Pollock is another guy who did well in the competition, who I've known for a few years now, and every year his work gets better. In fact, I think he's probably producing the best work of the Scottish Highlands at the moment, notwithstanding people whose work I haven't actually seen. But amazing.
I just did a on landscape article about him.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm actually let me grab this thing here. Part of my book binding, I've been making a print box of prints, and Brian's actually got a couple of images in here. I don't know what I've got on top. No, not one of his, but yeah. When I was curating my sort of best 20 photos of Scotland from photographers, I've been doing print swaps.
Oh, nice. That's smart.
Two of his are in there. He's one of two photographers with two images. So, I do love his work.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Alex, it's always a pleasure talking to you. I miss our weekly meetings for NLPA, but I'm sure we'll get back into the swing of things here when judging kicks up again. So.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's always great chatting to you, Matt. And thanks very much for having me on and harping on about my book, which you must buy.
And where do people buy? Where can people find it?
Yeah, just through my website, alexnail.com, which is probably going to be the only place I sell it, other than a few outlets up in the Northwest Highlands. Mm-hmm. And drop me an email if you're in some far-flung place where the postage is ridiculous. Or
I love it. All right, well, thanks again, Alex.
Cheers, Matt.
Well, thank you to Alex for the great conversation. It has been so much fun getting to know you over the past 5 years, and a true honor to work with you on the Natural Landscape Photography Awards. I can't wait to get a copy of your book, and I highly encourage others to purchase Alex's book as well. His dedication to capturing honest photographs of nature is highly inspiring to me, and being able to trust that every single photograph in the book was captured with this honesty in mind brings me a great deal of joy. If that resonates with you as well, please do help support Alex by getting a copy of his book today. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.